Okay, so thank you so much for joining us to this Introduction to Quantitative Ethnography webinar. So I want to emphasize that this is a webinar, not a workshop. So we're really just going to provide an overview of the methodology and how you can use it, and really emphasizing the how you can use it part. A lot of that is because we want to have you get a feel for what are some possible applications for using this methodology that perhaps will benefit you, and you can start to think about how you might be able to use this in your own work. And we hope to also encourage you to try to even pursue other opportunities to learn more about this, and even know that you have resources in me and Dr. Lee in doing this. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So here's an overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to do a very brief introduction of quantitative ethnography, but really I want to get to the heart of doing case studies and talking about our application of this work. So, and hopefully we get to all of it and we have enough time. And then we'll have some time at the end, hopefully also to do some Q&A. So feel free to hang on to any of your questions. We'll try to get to it in the chat, but Sung and I are kind of handling the screen share right now, so we might not be able to get to the chat right away, but we will definitely be taking a look in there. Okay, so quantitative ethnography. So in essence, we're really focused on the ethnography in terms of the type of data. So if you have qualitative data and you're not just wanting to do a thematic analysis, which tends to be the type of analysis that's taught at Pepperdine, but you want to appease people who are quant people with statistical significance with your analysis of your qual data, then this is a very helpful methodology to you. So where this starts is 2017. This book comes out that's by David Schaefer, and essentially the essence of quantitative ethnography is applying quantitative techniques onto qualitative data. What's some examples of qualitative data? And you feel free to put some in the chat, but qualitative data can be anything from interview data or social media posts, newspaper articles, anything that has words you can think of, that counts as qualitative data. And this book, if you are interested in wanting to dive deeply, we highly recommend reading it. We've tried to get the Pepperdine to also obtain copies of it, but hopefully if you also request it, hopefully that'll happen sooner. But it's also fairly inexpensive on Amazon, but we highly recommend checking that out. But the reason why it was developed was to help us to better tell the stories in our qualitative data. And this kind of integration of quantitative visualizations really helps us to tell the stories, because we're finding these deeper meanings by finding the connections between our constructs. So how we do that is through epistemic network analysis, which is a specific way of operationalizing quantitative ethnography. So I want to clarify. QE, or quantitative ethnography, is the concept and methodological approach of applying quantitative techniques to qualitative data, and epistemic network analysis, or ENA, is a go-to way of operationalizing this approach. And what epistemic network analysis, or ENA, does is it creates visualizations or models of seeing the connections between constructs in the data. And this, again, helps us to gain insights on patterns in the discourse or the text that we aren't necessarily able to capture from just a thematic analysis. And it builds off of this idea of epistemic frame theory, which is also cited in the book. So to kind of help you get a sense for this application or use of epistemic network analysis, we have a video that was created by the people where the lab where this methodology originated from, which is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, just for some reference point. And the clip we're going to look at is from an episode of Law and Order Special Victims Unit, or SVU, and it's a dialogue happening between three of the characters. We're gonna see the episode, see the clip just as it is. Then we're gonna see the dialogue, although I might just shift to the part where there's just the, if I can, the part where it's just the transcription of the discourse. And then it's gonna create a real-time visualization of the epistemic network analysis models, or ENA models, next to it. So I'll go ahead and go to this. Okay, now this is a really great part of the video because we're able to see all three of the discourse models, the epistemic network analysis models of each of the characters, and we're able to compare their discourse. And so we can see, just even looking at George, Donald, and Olivia, that Olivia has very different discourse and ideas than George does versus Donald, and based on the connections they're making between the constructs. So these models help us to tell the story of how their discourse is different. Any initial impressions on this so far, or questions?
Is this something that you prepared, or is this a software program that is doing all of this?
Sure, yes. So it is, so you will prepare your data, you code your data qualitatively, and then you upload it to a web tool. So I will say this is a real-time visualization, but normally what happens is that you would have all your data in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you upload it to a web tool that will create these visualizations using your data. And that web tool is free.
And these are the outputs that you would be able to see from the web tool. You won't actually see the lines being created, but you would see these three models if those were what you wanted in the end.
Great. And this is, again, just to kind of give you an overview and some insights. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into getting to this point, but we just want you, again, to understand what this can look like, and how you can see and envision what the application can be. Okay, so now we're going to start to dive into case studies or examples of how we've been using ENA in our data. And we have three specific examples, 3 different studies, 3 different papers that we've written. And the first one we're going to do is based on a project that we've been working on for the last 6 years called, let's see if I can get to this next slide, IC4, the IC4 project. And specifically, we're going to be looking at video meetups. And I'll explain a little bit about the background of the IC4 project. So what this is the International Community for Collaborative Content Creation. It's an NSF-sponsored project that started in late 2016. And essentially, it's kids from different countries, adolescent students, who collaborate and discuss projects that they co-create or singularly create, projects they create about STEM topics. And this is to help them to enhance their STEM learning. And so one of the main ways that the students communicate and work together is through these synchronous video conference calls they have on once a week called global meetups. I want to say we started this project before the pandemic, so we were using video conferencing before the pandemic. And so at the time, this was very innovative to be able to have students from different countries jumping onto a video conference platform, Zoom. We were using Zoom before everybody else as well, to talk with each other. And so what we would do is we would analyze the transcripts of these meetups. So we have a video that explains the project a little bit more, and I'll go ahead and play that for us. And this video was created by alumni from our project. Oh, sound. I can't hear it, so Sung, you might need to unmute yourself again. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah. we'll go back.
Okay, yeah, you go ahead and do it.
The pandemic has highlighted the feasibility of working with peers remotely and the limitations of virtual communication. While collaborative work was more challenging due to current events, students in our project were able to adapt and showcase learning content together.
Since 2017, the International Community for Collaborative Content Creation, or IC4, has been bridging students from 4 continents and is currently expanding into the Middle East North Africa region.
Student participants collaborate on multimedia projects, including videos, slideshows, coding projects, and prototypes to apply their skills and knowledge on various STEM topics. Students actively participate in weekly online global meetups to share their progress and receive feedback for any improvements. These calls inspire students to analyze their work critically and encourage them to delve deeper to uncover innovative solutions for relevant issues within their communities. This form of collaboration also facilitates informal discussion among members, generating an inclusive environment for students that produces a vibrant working space amidst a turbulent and isolating pandemic.
As we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and face its ensuing uncertainties, the community fostered by passionate students in IC4 serves as a consistent environment to effectively communicate among peers in a space that is conducive for collaboration and STEM learning.
IC4 research uses epistemic network analysis, ENA, an approach that supports quantitative ethnography to visualize connections between constructs observed in discourse related to individual and group experience in meetups. Researchers have identified key constructs appearing in meetups, such as a social or collaborative disposition, giving feedback, exhibiting curiosity, and more. Looking at transcripts of meetups, researchers mark down or code when different constructs appear in students' discourse. Then, ENA creates visualizations from this coded transcript, showing us the strength of connections between constructs during meetups. Now, with 5 years of data, the discourse patterns found in our analysis have revealed major insights. Recent research has found prompting fosters content-related connections in student discourse and furthers their curiosity. Researchers also use chat, cultural historical activity theory, to examine how COVID affected IC4, looking at the tensions created in the usual activity systems of the project.
So interesting. I think that it's cool.
Show the world that you can do it. Okay. All I have to say is that you can make it.
Possible to learn as long as you enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, then you won't learn it as well.
Eu ainda vou falar que a realidade virtual pode ser muito usada para aqueles.
I really want to learn about culture, different cultures.
Our project has withstood the isolating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and served as an outlet for students in quarantine to network with peers from around the world. Student participants adapted to the rapidly changing circumstances by developing innovative solutions to address complex problems within their local and global communities.
Okay, great. So that's a video from our project. It's nice to see the participants. We're actually wrapping up the project now, and yeah, it's been quite interesting, no doubt. So one of the main sources of data that we've been analyzing from this particular research project has been the conversations that students have in the meetups. So what we do is we actually record the Zoom sessions, and we are able to transcribe in entirety the conversations that they have. And the reason why we do that is we are interested in examining how the students interact and collaborate in these spaces, and especially around STEM learning. And so with that research question, that's our driving research question. We want to analyze specifically their discourse patterns and to see how it occurs in these meetups. And so right here, I wanted to give you an example of the types of discussion that takes place in our meetups. And so in this case, in this slide, we have 3 participants who are sharing about, they're talking about clean water and sanitation, right? So we have speaker A talking about, and asking a question, what are some of the other creative ways that we can deal with issue of clean water and sanitation? And another student mentions, I heard of UV rays. I think it's a brilliant idea, right? It's providing validation to a suggestion or to an idea. And then the first speaker comes back and says, oh, I read it from a magazine that UV rays, we can use it to kill the DNA of microorganisms, right? And then the second speaker comes back and says, wow, that's an interesting idea. You might want to look into it to see if some of the bacteria are already resistant to UV rays. And then a third student joins in and says, oh, by the way, we have a wastewater treatment plant outside. And this particular student lives in Las Vegas, outside of town, where they actually use ozone to purify water, and asks another question saying, oh, do you know how cost effective it is to use UV radiation for purifying water? So just wanted to give you a sense of what type of discussions take place during our meetups. So we have lines and lines and lines and lines of conversation like this. What do? How can we analyze it? The way we do it is we code the data, right? We take line by line of student utterances and we code the data. And by analyzing the massive amounts of transcripts that we have, this is one of the code books that we've come up with to analyze this discourse data from the students. And this particular code book includes 7 codes. And for example, we have a code called content focus, which is used whenever the students are talking about STEM related content. We have a code called curiosity when they're asking for further information or they're seeking clarification. We have a code called feedback when they are communicating their opinions or making suggestions. We have information sharing. You can already see, when we're analyzing, we say info sharing instead of information sharing. But whenever they're sharing their own experiences or providing contextual information, and we have something media production when they're talking about anything related to producing media artifacts, participatory teaching. It's a very important code in our analysis. Is when students help other students learn STEM topics. And finally, this code book in this particular analysis, we had social disposition, which was whenever students demonstrated pro-social tendencies. So by validating or expressing appreciation, acknowledging other people's contributions. So this was the code book that we used for our analysis. And how we apply this type of code book to the data is in this manner. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have the data, which consists of the utterances spoken by the students. And then on the right-hand side, we have the codes going across the top. And we use something called binary coding, where if that code is present in the data, we put a 1. And if it's not present, we put a 0. So for example, in this particular utterance, we're saying that we're analyzing that this person talked about STEM content and they expressed some sort of curiosity. They weren't really providing feedback, right? They were sharing information and they didn't talk about media, or they weren't teaching other students, and they didn't have any type of social disposition being displayed. Yeah. And so we would go line by line to see if their particular utterance included any of the codes that were of interest to us. And so you can imagine how an average meetup would usually have around, I would say, 400 to 600 lines of utterances. And you can imagine how we would get, after coding was done, we would get this massive matrix of 1s and 0s filling an Excel sheet. And so that is the data that we would put into the ENA web tool for analyzing their discourse patterns.
Okay, I think I'm picking up here. So that was an awesome explanation of how we code our data. And when we do it in this manner, we are able, ENA allows us to examine different types of research questions using a variety of type metadata. And so one of the metadatas that we can do, for example, is the level of participation, like how much students talked. We can look and examine, okay, what's the difference in the discourse between those who talked a lot versus those who didn't talk a lot? Is there a difference? And so we wanted to explore that idea, and we looked at two meetups, one from April 2017 and one from November 18. I should note that this is a paper we wrote a few years ago, but it's a great one. And what we did was we categorized the students into two types based again on the number of times they spoke, the number of lines they had. What we did is we did an average, and if they were below the average or above the average, then we grouped them into high or low designations. And from there, we created ENA models to examine their discourse patterns and to compare them. So what we have here is on the left, we have the higher participation group, so the ones who talked a lot. And on the right, in blue, we have the lower participation group, so the ones who talked not as much. So when we look at an ENA model, the first thing we usually like to do is try to define the space. And so we define it from left to right and what's on the right. So on the left, the space is defined with feedback on the left and content focus on the right. And then top and bottom, at the top, we have curiosity and social disposition at the bottom. And then the next thing we look at is also the line thickness. So when we look at the line thickness, it tells us that there's a stronger relationship between those constructs. And then when we see the thicker lines, the thicker the relationship, and then in contrast, the thinner the line, then the thinner the relationship. And when we look at this, we can tell that the patterns and the connections are different. The higher participation students, they tend to more focus on the left side and have strong connections between media production and feedback, media production, social disposition, and media production, info sharing. But on the right, on the model on the right here with the lower, we start to see that they have more connections to the constructs on the right. And they even have a link that's stronger to participatory teaching that we don't necessarily see as strong. So in order to even go deeper into really getting at the exact differences, we can do a subtracted network, which all it's doing is just one minusing the other. So if they have the same connections, then they cancel each other out. And we can see that, again, the students that talked a lot are on the left. They had these stronger connections, and the students who didn't talk as much, they had these stronger connections on the right. So if we were just doing a thematic analysis, we wouldn't be able to necessarily tell this, but ENA helps us to create these visualizations so we can tell the story better, right? The other thing about it is when we do interpretation is that this should not be a surprise to us because we coded the data, we have a sense of what we're going to expect. And really, the model is complementing the story that we're telling. So I just want to emphasize that. And sometimes it does show something surprising, but if it's too far off from what you know from the data, then check your coding. But for the most part, this is actually consistent with what we coded for. So our conclusion was that there are complementing discourse patterns between the students who talked a lot and the students who didn't talk as much. And so if anything, the students, normally you might think the students who don't talk a lot, they're not contributing anything meaningful, but the opposite is true in our particular learning setting. The students who don't talk a lot, they contribute something very meaningful, even though they're not saying much. When they say something, it's really strong and something unique and adding to the richness of the exchange that's happening with the students. So that is one of our papers. We have a lot of papers. You can check out our website, ic4.site. I'll put it in the chat window, but we'll go ahead and move on to our next use case, which is a completely different data set.
Yeah, so for the second case study, we're going to be looking or examining audio diaries of healthcare workers during the onset of COVID-19. So we looked at video data which we transcribed and analyzed. Now we're taking audio data and we're analyzing that. And so to give you an introduction of what the data set was, it came from a podcast called The Nocturnist. And the podcast actually asked healthcare workers to submit audio diary entries. And so many healthcare workers during the pandemic, they actually recorded themselves reflecting on their day, and they submitted these audio files to the podcast. And what the podcast did is they took them, they didn't really do anything to them. They might have edited them. I don't think they even did too much editing, but they compiled them, and then they produced a website that contained these different reflections from healthcare workers. And this was during the early part of the pandemic, from around March 2020 to June 2020. And for this particular paper, we looked at about 50 diaries of healthcare workers. And of the 50, we selected 40 total entries because we wanted to focus on the in-hospital work experience of the healthcare workers. And so I don't know if we have time, but maybe if we have time, we can take a listen to, so this is the website, the podcast. Maybe we can listen to a portion of one of these. So this is an anonymous geriatrician from, I think it's the Bay Area, and from March 31.
We are day whatever of Corona land. And at this point, I'm just angry. I and my colleagues in geriatrics have been saying for decades that the US healthcare system is broken. And the people who suffer the most are the old people. And I don't know why I expected that in a pandemic things would be any different. I've spent the last week trying to convince my colleagues to start some research. I've been scouring all of the websites where there's research posted and realizing that not a single one of them is thinking about old people. Every single thing we know about this disease is that the people who die the most are the people above age 60 and especially above age 80. There's not a single research trial that's actively trying to recruit old people. And I've talked to several of the PIs of these trials about what you'll need to do to actively recruit old people, and they decided that that was too hard. So let's make another fucking trial where we learn everything about how it works in young people when it's not a young person's disease.
All right, we'll end it there. I apologize for the language there, but it is as the recording was done. And so you can already hear the richness of emotion, and they are really literally reflecting on what's happening at that moment in their work in this pandemic, right? So thankfully, and I'm looking at the chat here, the podcast had transcribed these audio entries, diary entries, and so we're able to take that and use it for our analysis. And because of the fact that, so we actually had to create 2 code books because of the fact that there was so much emotional content that was being expressed, in addition to the professional and the personal aspects that they were professional and personal impact of the pandemic that they were describing. So we had one code book here focusing on the professional and personal and looking at things like resource availability, situational assessment, whether they sometimes were talking about policies, etc. And we had a whole different code book looking at the emotions that they were expressing. And we could, for this particular analysis, we focused on emotions as they were expressed, meaning in the words that they use in the entries themselves. Yeah, so that was sort of the limit, how we focused our analysis. And so you can see here, we had a bunch of negative emotions, and we also coded for several positive emotions as well. And so looking at the ENA models that came from this data set, so first we're focusing in on the professional and personal constructs, what the different connections, what the strength of connections were between these various constructs. And one of the nice things about ENA is the ability to disaggregate the data, to look at the patterns according to and as Danielle mentioned, according to different meta variables or categorizing variables. So on the right hand, so this on the left hand side, that's the overall discourse pattern. On the right hand side, what we have are 3 separate models looking at diary entries from March. So this red one is looking at just the diary entries from March. The purple one is looking at the diary entries from April, and the May entries are described or summarized in the blue ENA model. Yeah, so to a certain extent, what we can see is this shift. You can already see these stronger links during March between resource availability, medical treatment policies, focusing around here. And then there's a shift later in April, there's greater connections being made to psychosocial support that is required. And also, but still very much focused on resource availability and medical treatment. And in the later models, in May, there's greater connection now being made to preventive measures that are needed. And also definitely stronger connections being made to situational assessment, right? So given that the pandemic was in its 3rd month, people are now able to kind of take a moment, take a look back, and start to assess where we were. And in terms of looking at the emotional constructs, we were able to do the same thing and look at the shift in the emotions that were expressed in the diary entries from March, April, and May. And what we saw was strong connections between fear and uncertainty and anger, and some gratitude as well. And that was maintained through April. And while in May, there was this shift towards greater connections between uncertainty, compassion, sadness, and also fatigue. Yeah, so what we were able to conclude from this analysis was that in terms of looking at the professional and personal impacts, there was a shift responding to immediate needs in March to deeper reflections in later in May. Uncertainty in terms of the emotional constructs, uncertainty was a prominent emotion throughout the duration, but we were noting that these emotions became more internalized. So from anger and gratefulness towards sadness and compassion. One of the big limitations that we thought in doing this research was that we're only able to focus on the words that were uttered, right? So in terms of the emotions, we're focusing on whether they said, "Oh, I am angry," but not how they said it. And so future work, we're thinking that future work could actually look at also we can include elements of how they would, how they are expressing themselves, not only in terms of the language or the words that they use, but in their voice and their inflection, etc. So, and that we definitely have it from the audio. So, so those are some thoughts on potential future research work.
Okay, thanks so much for that. So we've already looked at in our first case study use case, we were looking at discourse data where people are talking with one another, and the transcripts, and I want to address in the chat, these are essentially, we take the audio from the video, and then we actually use a automated transcription service, but then we have two people, like humans, review them for accuracy to make sure, and then we do the analysis. So we have that discourse data. The second that we just read was that we heard about was an audio diary from individuals. And this third one, we're going to look at social media posts and how they expressed workplace experiences, specifically Instagram posts of regarding museum workplace experiences. So just to give some context for this data set we're going to look at next. In 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a renewed discourse on racism that came to the forefront, including in workplaces. In the museum sector, there was an Instagram account that emerged where museum employees, past and present, could anonymously submit their experiences of racism and exclusion. And for me, reading these posts as someone who is involved in the museum sector, I knew that usually the leadership of many of the organizations were just hoping that this would just be a place where people were venting, and then that would just pass. And so rather than it just be a passing trend, me and a colleague really desired to document this phenomena and give it a voice that couldn't be ignored through doing analysis and publishing it. So I'm going to go ahead and show a little bit about the data set itself, which is the Instagram account is called Change the Museum. And what we did was we looked at the initial posts. So this started in June 2020, and we wanted to look at just 2 months because there was a variety of posts that happened between June 2020 and July 2020. And there were 199 posts that we examined that were written as first-person accounts, and we wanted to see, okay, what are the patterns of discourse that are emerging from here? And what we noticed is that there seemed to be two types. The personal posts, where the person was directly involved, who submitted was directly involved in the experience, and then there was the observed post, where someone witnessed the situation. So we used that to kind of separate the difference between the two. We data scraped, so we took all the Instagram posts and put them into a spreadsheet to code them. And these are some examples of the utterances that we pulled and the two different categories that we assigned to them, whether it was personal versus observed. So we have the personal one, where you see, if you read the utterance, the person is identifying it's their own experience of someone who is commenting on their look being darker. And then we have another utterance here, which is observed, where they see it, that person was not necessarily saying that they were directly involved, but they are noting that it happened, they observed this. And in this case, this person was referring to themselves as Hitler, knowing that there were assistants who were Jewish. So these are the types of posts that we were examining. And then from a grounded analysis, we also developed a code book of a couple of constructs. I've just included a few. There were a lot more constructs that we coded for, but race, gender, employment, and ignorance. I'm going to keep going for time. Microaggressions, positional influence, retaliation, and tokenism. So similar to the process, again, that was described previously, right? We did a binary coding if these codes were present in each of the posts, and then we generated models to compare personal posts versus the observed posts. And then here's the resulting models. On the left, we have the personal posts, and then on the right, we have the model for the observed posts. And if you look within the model, the positions of the different constructs, we have the space defined by ignorance on the left and gender on the right, microaggressions the bottom, employment at the top. And when you look at this, we can see that the observed posts on the right, they have a very, very strong connections between ignorance and race. and positional influence in race, and microaggressions in race. That microaggressions in race is also seen in the personal posts, which are represented on the left. But on the left, there's even connections that are drawing to gender, to employment in ways that aren't being seen in the observed posts. And when we do a subtracted network, we can more clearly see the differences between the two. And we can see that, again, the observed posts, which are the red, again, we see more distinct that that's the connection with the ignorance and positional influence, and positional influence in microaggressions. Whereas on the right, again, we have these more connections related to gender and race, gender and microaggressions, and also employment and retaliation. So what does this tell us? So from this initial analysis, we found that the posts are, there is some difference between them, as I mentioned, between personal experiences, more bringing out more things related to gender, employment, and retaliation. And these are more hidden aspects that aren't as seen in, which makes sense, right? Because these are personal accounts versus what's just observed. And so these complementary patterns help us to understand that there needs to be a space where people can call out behavior, but also like self-disclose, because clearly people, there are things if we just, we have to have safe spaces for people to personally share, because otherwise we're going to lose these experiences that need to be improved on. And we need to get a fuller picture of how these experiences are and how we can change them. So that is our last case study. And I wanted to go ahead and share a couple of next things for us, and then we'll open it up for some questions. But thank you so much for listening to just some of our papers that we've written. All of these are papers we've written, different analyses that we've done. And next week, next Thursday, we actually have some colleagues who are going to be talking more about QE. And let me tell you that we've previewed the talk and it's absolutely brilliant. And it will go into more depth onto QE theoretically and how it comes to be. And then our other colleague will also be sharing about their journey in QE, and it's so relatable and so understandable, especially as she's a cultural anthropologist, and it really makes a lot of sense. But now she works with in the health sciences field. It's really interesting. Highly recommend. It's going to be in person and also hybrid. And the other part is in the afternoon, we'll have an in-person workshop that is in person only. We're not doing that hybrid because all of you, because you've attended this seminar, you're going to be welcome to attend the virtual workshop that we will be hosting on Saturday, July 23rd. It is fairly long because this is not, even the workshop going through that, it's not, there's always more to be learning, but we want to kickstart you into getting more hands-on, and that's a really hands-on opportunity to get involved. Students are also able to enroll into this course for the fall, which I think registration is next week. And then I really want to point out the website, which is qesoc.org. And then feel free to email either of us with any questions or comments. So thank you so much again for listening and hearing us out. And we're around for any questions. And I think someone already had to head out. Thank you so much for being here. We're so grateful. And we'll be around, though, if you have any questions.
Yes.